What a joy to be in a space with people who talk about stuff that is on my heart and in my mind and literally in my body every day when I interact in my community. Um, what a powerful beginning. I'm thinking, I've got a clock next to me, Rob. I have so much to say. I'm going to try to do it in 45 minutes less so we can have a conversation. But I ended up changing quite a bit of what I was going to say last night. So I didn't time it. And you're going to call time. You're
We're
also going to,
we're flexible, Marilee, so
yeah.
we want to hear from you.
And to certain points, I'm going to stop and just get reflections, and I'm going to depend 100% on you and possibly others who are co-facilitating to notice comments that are in the chat. I won't be able to watch that or making comments because I'll ask questions that are not rhetorical. I'm hoping thought provoking. So Jen Hutchins was the one who you delegated to introduce me, and the way that I condensed our conversation was how to have conversations with people who disagree with you as a person, disagree with you as your position that you're taking on some issue like homelessness, disagree with how you do things. Disagreement can show up in so many ways. So that's what's guiding me as I'm talking through this. I wanted to offer, we're all human beings. Every single person here is a rock star, and all of us have our lived experience. And I just want to offer that one of the powerful things is the director of the Center for Dialogue and Resolution gives me position and privilege. I also am amongst one of your 19 Peace Laureates in Pierce County since 2005. We've been naming Peace Laureates. So you've got to nominate them and get them out there. But I also want us to consider that to make peace, you have to understand that conflict exists, and that is not a comfortable place to be. So I'm inviting you as I share some tools, some ideas, possibly some opinions. If you get uncomfortable, guess what? That's good. We're thinking, we're engaging. This is how you actually have conversations, is invite the uncomfortable and stay in that space and stay grounded. I also want to offer, probably because her birthday was last week, my grandmother's comment when over 4 decades ago I told her what I was going to study and what I was going to do. And she's like, Marilise, is that like listen to people and learn about them before you talk? Isn't that like common sense? And I just sort of sat quietly and said, yes. And then her comment has held me true, is she said, that's probably the least common of the senses. I now get why you're dedicating yourself to that. So I bring Eris Holbush into the room and thank for all the other ancestors that we have amongst us. If I'm lucky, these are the topics. And guess what? I will send Rob, Rosemary, and Teresa, and Jan the copies of this. Probably delete some of my notes underneath because they weren't very well thought out. But I want to talk about is before you have a conversation, you probably should think first. And so let's talk about what do you think about when you're thinking about engaging with someone who disagrees with you. Think about the relationship, the disagreement, and why you have chosen to engage. Then we want to review the communication process. I recognize every single person on this call actually has, from the time of birth, have learned how to communicate. So I'm in amongst experts here. But sometimes naming the obvious, just like my grandmother said, brings up our consciousness and we see a new way to apply and to use. And with that, I want to just talk about the strategic power of listening to learn, which I recognize is in your code of conduct. And then looking for what are those connections that empower, because this is a coalition, and a coalition holds all sorts of different perspectives. So what is that connections that empower? So taking a quick look, as yes, I am speaking as the director of the Center for Dialogue and Resolution, and I think our mission grounds us, or grounds me, to make sure I don't get out of too far over my skis. It's that in resolving differences, we actually strengthen relationships in community with inclusive and equitable dialogue. And I've put up there what I pulled off the website. I don't know if it's your mission or it's your strategic focus, but the very purpose for the existence of the Pierce County Coalition to End Homelessness, which I do have a t-shirt that's almost worn out. That tells you how long I've been hanging out with you guys. We connect and mobilize people to take action to end homelessness. and think about the first 17 minutes of this call. The calling out of the pain and suffering of people, the powerful motivation of historical stories with Francis. This is not easy work. You already are very skilled at stepping into the uncomfortable and looking at it. And so let's take a look at some thinking tools. What I redid this morning, thank heavens I have a partner who provokes me to say, why are you going to do that? Why don't you do this? We had a fantastic conversation with Julio Kwan, who also once in a while shows up with all of you. And I'm going to use the thought process of a continuum from here to there. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And let's put on the continuum what we're talking about, what you guys are talking about, what you guys are acting about. If the focus, the strategic focus is end homelessness, then let's think through the different aspects that are there. We've got different, what was referred to as positions. We can have prevent homelessness, so we don't have to end it. We can have relieve the suffering, which is what I've heard a lot between the hailstorm and information and cover and shelter emergency. That's about relieving the suffering. And we have the other extreme is let them die. And that is not easy words to say. It's even more difficult words to accept. And you all understand that the people that you disagree with sometimes are making policy that actually underscores let them die as an option. Mm-hmm. So I want to say that when we're talking about disagreements, I am not some peace laureate that thinks if we just hug and kiss, we're going to solve all problems. Hugging and kissing is good, but it's not where we're going to make change. And I'd like to offer with a challenge that every single one of you, well, I don't know all of you, so I'm sorry. Welcome. I'm Marilise, but most of you have heard me say, if we're talking about end homelessness, we're dealing with the symptoms. We're dealing with the wet feet because you live on the street and we're giving you dry socks. We're dealing with hunger and the rising costs of food and lack of access of cooking or preparing. We're talking about actually the getting out of the elements of the environment. We're talking about a sense of belonging. All of those are elements that you all are dealing with when you talk about symptoms. And thank you, Rosemary, because I think the conversation between Frances Perkins and Roosevelt really does show her conditions to accept that position. If you look at every single one of those conditions that Heather Cox wrote and Rosemary brought to us, those are elements of bringing an end to poverty. What I've just described are simple thinking tools that you can use. Now you're getting Marilise Hood personal reflection. We live in a society that is 100% committed, and I'm not making a criticism of who we are, that capital is how things go. That is what it's about. The capitalist society. We buy things, we sell things, we distribute things, and we have money or we don't have money, and we try to accumulate more. Those are all dynamics of capital and the aspect of accumulating. But what Frances was offering was we need to balance that with government policies that actually overcome overaccumulation, concentration like in monopolies, and a government that balances with the human aspect, social security, unemployment, insurance, et cetera, et cetera. So just hold in your head as you think about how are we going to end homelessness, how are we going to end poverty, and recognize that a system of capital that isn't human-based will always go towards accumulating and not dealing with the poorest. So we have to figure out new ways. And part of that work is at the level of cooperation and finding new ways to do that. Are you seeing lots of comments? Am I driving people crazy and making them uncomfortable? Anything we have to stop before I go on?
No, people are rapt and paying attention from what I can tell.
All right, ready to give me a different perspective. But I so appreciate that was the lens with which we started today. So how to have conversations with people who disagree. I've already said think. I'm going to give you some of those essential tools. Sometimes they sound really simple, like my grandma would say, common sense. Think about who do you want to interact with? Why do you want to do that interaction? What's the topic that is going to be the most productive and useful? Where is the space that we can hold that conversation? When is the right time to be able to do it? And how will we do it? I sort of assume that most of us by third grade knew those W's and that one H that's also got a W. That's what I always told my third grade teacher. There's a W in the how. Hold that as a mental model when you're thinking through things, and you won't miss out on something. Sorry, I should learn how to do notifications. Then we're talking about how will you do that connection, and a few different communication techniques. But the crucial piece is that in this engagement, in this connection, that you walk into the connection willing to learn. And I think that's where we get into this aspect right now that we're feeling is we're polarized. We have different camps. We don't want to talk to each other. I don't want to hear a different perspective. What we're saying is, I don't want to learn how to look at the world from your perspective. That would be most people who avoid looking at someone who lives on the streets, rather than I, who spent 18 months with neighbors. They just happened to be on the other side of my sidewalk. And that interaction was daily. And most people are shocked when I say, after 18 months of living next to a community that was on the other side of the sidewalk, I actually walked home and felt scared. I didn't have my people around me that actually made sure I got in. I've had people help me bring in groceries. I mean, we've had a relationship. So the willingness to be open to learn. And what we need to think about is, when I was talking before, is competition is great. And we are a community, a society built on competition. That's not bad. It's just, what are we competing against? Are we competing against ourselves? How can I show up better today than I did yesterday? Are we competing to improve how every single person, instead of being ending homelessness, we are competing to be the community that ensures homefulness? That's a great competition I'd love to see. And then where is the cooperation? How can we open up lines of cooperation and common ground? And then, of course, you can imagine talking and acting. And Teresa did the huge favor of picking up a bunch of bookmarks. My last slide will be the bookmark. I don't know if many of you made it to the social last week. Thank you so much for that. Or this week, Teresa, thank you so much. But we really do. The listen, learn, talk, act is the essence. We tried to boil it down. And sometimes the essence is the most difficult thing to do. But here we are practicing. So another thought tool, another continuum, is let's stop for a little bit and think about what is an enemy, and what is all of those different terms. Usually it's considered an enemy is a focus on eliminating the others. So when we think about that continuum I offered you before, let them die, there's an enemy of, I don't want my tax dollars to go to pay for other people who don't work. That's a position that they're taking. We'll talk more about that. So any questions about that continuum that I've put up that goes from enemy, adversary, indifferent, ally, friend, and partners?
Not seeing any hands go up. Oh, there's one, Rosemary.
I'm just struck by the word enemy being right above the word competition, and your comment earlier that competition is a good thing. So how am I competing with my enemy? That's good.
Well, that is the end. That is, so we can look at competition on a continuum as well, Rosemary. There's the aspect of competition that leads us to greater cooperation and interaction and improving our skills and our ability. But from the enemy perspective of, I win, you lose, I live, you die, that would be the ultimate end of the continuum that would put the enemy. And there's an aspect of enemy and competition that is probably competition without respect of your very existence, as opposed to an adversary, which includes an element of there. With an adversary, there still is some human respect, and there might even be individual tactical moments where with an adversary, you can turn them into an ally for one specific moment. I know this is being recorded and I'm trying to be sensitive to that, but as I talk to other business owners who complain about someone living on their front stoop, they are an ally to end homelessness with all of you because they feel that it impacts their business. They may not particularly be into being empathetic and understanding of the human being and the causes for that person having to use the front porch as a cover during the night, and that there's basic human needs and they were unable to deal with their biological needs except on that front porch. They may not have empathy for that, but they certainly might be interested in being an ally to end homelessness. That'd be the extreme. Other questions, thoughts about these different? I want to offer, if we're having a conversation with people who disagree with you, sometimes an adversarial conversation is so much easier than a conversation with someone who is indifferent. The indifference can feel like a lack of empathy, like a lack of interest, like a lack of ability to sort of think of others. And strategically speaking, that might be your largest group of people that you all as a coalition need to figure out how to work with and talk to, is how do you begin to engage those who are indifferent? Because if you can turn them into allies, much less friends, they become part of your coalition to change the dynamic, change the conversation, change the topics. Again, easily we could spend an hour right here of looking at a continuum of the different types of relationships. I've got an amazing article from 2013 of the New York Times, and I will try to remember to do it. And guess what? Rob will nudge me if I don't get to that, to be able to consider those things. I'm going to move on. Hold these thoughts in mind. Because when you think about where is somebody on the continuum from the academic field of conflict resolution, these are some concepts that are useful to understand, and they can be useful as you begin to plan how are you going to have a conversation. So basically a position is an inflexible demand or solution. I think to a certain degree, if we think about the camping ban as a position, that's a policy position. The impacts of it are huge, but that was a position is we would rather have inanimate objects on our parking strips rather than human beings living. And the position is we want them out of sight. The position is let us not see them. Whereas underneath positions, if you think of it as a demand and a solution, and it's sort of the tip of the iceberg, and you go a little bit lower, you can begin to ask, what are their interests? What is their interest in that? And that can be that you can look at an interest as the values that inform their actions and their choices. There are interests of maintaining privilege. There are interests of keeping things the way they are. There are interests of those. So it's not a radical thought, but it does open the door for some common ground as you begin to try to take somebody from being indifferent to being an ally, or from an enemy to become an adversary. If you can find those interests underneath, and there's some of those values that are in common. There is a cognitive dissonance of sometimes we have a value and then our actions are completely the opposite of that. That's a little bit difficult to manage. That's a little bit more sophisticated in the communication. But it's worth asking, listening, when you hear the words of I believe, when you hear it's important to me, you're hearing those value statements. And sometimes if you see an action you do not understand, you can ask them, why was that important? And you begin to discover and learn what are their interests. And those become the ground upon which you can build relationships that goes from that extreme to the more cooperative. Useful to consider what is a need, because sometimes we can say a need is something and it really is just a want or a whim. So if you really think about needs as simple as that which is essential for existence. And if you think about the coalition, ending homelessness, you've identified that topic, not just shelter, not just housing, but home, which includes all that happens under that shelter, that includes the relationships of belonging is what home is about. That concept of home as essential for existence covers many of those basic human needs that we have, without which we will die. And it's not just food, dry clothing, and shelter. There's those other aspects of self-realization, actualization, ability to have purpose. And sometimes that is way more important than a house, which is where my combined with the people that I lived with here is their tents are their shelters. What they needed help is medical help. They needed all sorts of other basic needs before they even talked about how to get out of that tent. So it's a powerful, I believe those concepts, as you're doing that thinking part, can be useful. Any questions for clarification?
Not seeing any right now.
So hang on to those as you're sort of doing the thinking of, and I just put it into this aspect of, often if we think about an enemy or an adversary, our positions are in competition. If we think about from indifferent to ally to friend, we're beginning to find common interests. And I would say it's a much more profound strategic alliance when friends and partners are connected to needs. So of the conversation, which of course now I've lost track of what's my next slide, but I want to say that from this perspective, that's the big picture of how to talk to people that you disagree with. But guess what? Sometimes you disagree with your partners. It's not uncommon in the struggle. We're all exhausted. We're all stretched to the max. We're all seeing really difficult things, can feel impotent, and really good friends and allies. We can speak inappropriately. We can say things that hurt. We can have a slightly different way of how we would solve the problem. And instead of looking for how are we going to cooperate, and the diversity of responses is really valuable, we begin to say my way is the only way and there's limited resources, and we begin competing from that perspective. So I just want to offer that when we talk about how to talk with people you disagree with, it isn't just you and your partner facing it off with the enemy on the two extremes of the continuum. We can have disagreements anywhere in this continuum, and the tools become different elements to be able to use there. Oops. I'm going to assume this sounds familiar to many of you, but it's really useful sometimes to think about the most basic things. This is not I couldn't find my cool one that has actually a different way to look at it. But I think it's useful that if we're talking about opening up dialogue with someone we disagree with, at any given moment in the conversation, someone is sending the message and someone is receiving the message. And our lived experience, our biases of how we look at the world, our understanding of causation is how we encode, put it into code to the other party, but it also is how the other party receives it. It's very common that someone can say, hey, well, this is what you said. And you're like, well, yeah, that's what I said, but that's not what I meant. Or I've had arguments with people who are upset about something I said 2 weeks ago, and they completely missed 2 words. And the way they encoded or decoded my message was the exact opposite of what I meant to say, because those 2 words got lost in the transmission. So a message goes from one person to the other. Today we're choosing as our channel to use Zoom, but we're not only using the channel of Zoom, and we're all here live on a rainy Friday morning, but we've recorded it so other people can come back and look at it, which might actually make the decoding easier or more difficult. Who knows how that's going to go in terms of your whole meeting. But it's interesting to consider who at any given moment is the sender and how can they maximize their capacity to get the message to the receiver by choosing the right channel, by identifying what is the noise, which might be the implicit bias, might be just the fact that it's hard to hear and I have bad internet and I've been breaking up and it's been hard for you to hear. Noise comes in many different ways, and it's useful to consider that. But it is not a complete communication, which is actually why it's referred to as the cybernetic communication model, until the receiver lets the sender know, this is actually what I heard you say. Did I get it? Because before we start arguing, I want to make sure that I first have heard what you said, understand what you've said. And if I'm going to argue with you, that's what I'm arguing against, not what I thought you said. So again, a very essential, very simple model that allows people to get doctorates in communication, which is literally about how you maximize and improve each one of these different elements. Is there any question about these sort of pieces before we go on to the next? Somebody give me a Coalition to End Homelessness message and tell me how it's being received. Can we do a little bit of just apply this to the reality of what you're living? Ha! I get to see your faces.
Now we're on the spot.
That's right.
How about camping bans not only don't work, but they put people at risk?
And is there anyone on the continuum from partners to adversaries that message lands well?
I'd say it lands well everywhere up to the indifferent on the right-hand side. I'd say some people who are on the left-hand side of that continuum, it does land. I've had it land with people who are all about, this is important because it solves it. But if you have a conversation with them about the fact that it actually doesn't solve the problem, doesn't address anything basic about the fact that people are on the street, I've had people listen. I don't know what other people experience. I'm through talking. I just wanted to put that out there. So.
And I can see faces, but I'm not seeing the chat right now. So I'm looking to you, Rob, as as part of our channel.
Yeah, and I'm not seeing comments in the chat, and I've strategically been being quiet so that, because I end up speaking on behalf of the coalition quite frequently. But one of the things I would say is a common message that we share is that fining and putting people in jail for the just because they don't have a income to support living indoors is not going to solve the problem of homelessness.
But it is useful to consider both of what you said. Thank you for speaking up and speaking out, and others are delighted that you took, Marilee's is scary, so you guys took me on. That was good job. What's powerful is to say, if my friends understand my message, can I work with my friend and figure out what would it take for an indifferent to have an interest about this? And that means that you don't share your demand, right? Get people off the streets or whatever the demand is, but you actually look towards what is it that is that common? How can I phrase this in a way? And there was one group of people I was talking to, which I said, have you ever heard of a thing called a status crime? And Washington State happens to be incredibly high. We incarcerate youth for the simple act that they're young people and do not have a responsible adult with them. That's a different world I live in, but that's a status crime. And I said, what about the crimes of homelessness? And the person was just like, oh, there is no crime. And I said, let's walk through. Let's name all the ones we can think of. And making them consider that was uncomfortable, but it blew them away to consider, if you do not have the privilege of being economically self-sustaining, there are many things in our world that put you on the wrong side of the law simply because you don't have enough income. So I'm not giving you all the recipes, but I just want to offer that having the time to think those through about how you actually choose to put your message out there is a powerful step. Now I did what I was really afraid to do, Rob. We're going to see if this works.
Now you're going to go back to your presentation.
Yeah.
It worked.
It worked. You wouldn't believe I've been doing this for 6 or 7 years, would you? Okay, let's take a look at, we've already realized that we might have noise in our communication. We might have disagreements. We might have difficulty with people who love and care for us. And so the tools work to keep the coalition connected, to be able to bring in more people who from indifference, but it also works to amplify and to do that. And so what I want to offer is, again, I've got Era's hood right there in my head. That feedback, that little green arrow that we've got there. Feedback is not, I think you're brilliant and what you said is cool. That is not feedback. Can we all agree that's not feedback? Feedback from this perspective is, I'm just going to call her Blue Woman, which I just realized her colors match our colors at the center. Blue Woman, you just told me that people who do not have shelter living on the other side of the sidewalk makes your living experience in your home uncomfortable. There's human feces, there's garbage, there's scary discussion of drugs, there's people who sort of lose their patience and start yelling, and that really is hard for you to live with. I don't agree with a lot of the assumptions of the Blue Lady, but I've let her know that I've heard her. It doesn't mean you agree when you give feedback. It means that you are letting that person hurt. And I want to offer, in our society, it is uncommon for someone to actually hear that someone heard them, to feel acknowledged, seen, and validated as a human being. The best they get usually is what's often referred to as active listening, to say, yes, I've heard you. But that Blue Lady, who happened to be my next door neighbor, knew that I did not agree with most of her complaints. I was coming up with creative solutions to be able to solve those problems rather than going to city council and arguing about them. So she knew we disagreed. But to hear me repeat back to her what she said, there's 3 things that happen. One, she gets to hear her own words and say, ooh, that sounded kind of creepy. Let me figure out if I can clean that up. And I give her the chance to edit her message. It also allows her to say, you've been a little bit more strident than I meant. I'm open to options. I'm like, great, that's wonderful. So I missed part of her message and she's able to correct me. And the other thing is, I make sure that if I'm going to enter into a conversation where we're exploring our different interests and trying to find something, I'm not arguing things that aren't there. So I'm clarifying. And so with that, I will offer you, when you get a copy of this PowerPoint, the reasons why we summarize, or how to summarize. It's not a complete parroting back, but you're going to practice, and Rob has watched me practice in many different meetings, about restating the content in their words. And people think it's some kind of weird fairy dust that I've put into the meeting, and all I've done is just make sure we're hearing the person. And he called it fairy dust, so that's why I'm just quoting him. Avoid expressing your own judgment. Keep yourself and your thoughts out of it, and your interpretation and your opinions. And yesterday I was working with a really tough group, and what the woman said, she said, oh, we were practicing this. I don't think we're going to get to the practice today. Is she said, if I know I have to summarize, I have to listen to what they're saying rather than have the argument in my head while they're talking. It's like it keeps my gerbil brain focused, not on arguing, but on really being able to hear what was said and then to learn from that. It's beneficial to both the speaker and the listener, slows things down when we disagree, our emotions pop up, and it allows us to breathe through them. When you are summarizing, it's not the time to say, share your experience. I think my best lesson for this was many years ago. A friend of mine had cancer. And she said, the most hurtful thing people can tell me is how their Aunt Betty had the same kind of cancer. And she was with Aunt Betty the whole time. And then, of course, they end with, and she died. Like, Aunt Betty's experience and my experience, you're not helping at all. I hear you saying that, but it's not helpful. So you end up in that sympathy thing of like, kind of sucks to be you kind of world, rather than empathy is, I am here with you in this moment. And I do agree. On Sunday morning, when I walk out and there's human feces right outside my door, that is not the most unpleasant thing. I get that. I hear what you are saying. And I'm going to tell you, it's the most valuable tool in your toolbox. You're going to walk away from this conversation and say, oh my God, Marilyse is a peace laureate, and this is what she's telling us to do. Just hold on to when in doubt. When someone says something that really gets you, summarize before you respond, and it's going to give you a chance to be more strategic in your response. And with that, hopefully you all have gotten this, this bookmark. And this is sort of back to you, Rosemary, where competition. Guess what? Conflict is a good thing. Without it, we wouldn't have drama. We wouldn't have wonderful literature. We wouldn't have stories. It's the drama of the conflict that gets us hooked into really good books. And at the same time, can we see the drama of actually, we listen to hear what somebody is telling us and how the world looks from their point of view. We learn that perspective. And so when it's our turn to speak, it's so much easier to be respectful of how different they see things, and yet you're creating the space for your perspective. And when and if we reach agreements, we're going to be making better agreements that we can enact because we've included all of us. And the last thing I'm going to offer you, which is sort of why I like this bookmark, is when we rebranded ourselves from the Center for Dispute Resolution. I'm going to tell you, most people didn't want to walk through our front door. Dispute is not an inviting word. But when we changed ourselves to be the Center for Dialogue and Resolution, we've even got strikers for the school districts across the street. They love to stand in front of our sign as they're striking and take a picture of Center for Dialogue and Resolution. Why do we why do we spell dialogue without a UE? Way back when we changed the name and you looked it up in the dictionary, dialogue with a UE at the end of it was what happens in literature, in plays, in movies. Fictional characters interact, and that's dialogue. And when human beings take action, it's dialogue with a G. And by the way, that is what technology has done. They now call it the dialogue box. I can't believe they've taken our definition out of the dictionary. But anyway, I'm going to hold true to our roots, that it is learning to be uncomfortable and engaging with people who are different. And if I calculated right, you've got 4 minutes for questions, Rob.
Sounds great. Yeah, so any questions or comments? And please don't be shy. I know this group is not shy.
Well, I'm going to say something so that it gives people time to think about what they want to say, because you don't want to keep hearing the same people talk. I will say how very thankful I am, Marilyse, that you put this together and that you put so much about homelessness into your slides. I know that's work, and not only were your slides focused on the interest of this group, but they are also very, very clear. I'm excited that they will be going up so that other people can use them.
Thank you, Sage. I'm not sharing, so I can see your comments in the chat. Thank you so much, Sage.
So, Marilyse, here, I'll ask a silly question. So you've given us this tool set to start working with. Should we all just go now to our social media sites and decide to have these tough conversations with random people and live in all that comfort?
Okay, Rob, you forgot the first step. Think. Why do you want to have the conversation? That's the piece that is the toughest piece, is that think piece. Right now, how about I offer you a better way? And now I'm going to get credit for doing what I'm supposed to do as the director. We are having an open house on April 30th, in which we're using the idea and the metaphor of the Yellow Brick Road and courage and intelligence. You know who I'm talking about, the straw man, the lion, and looking at how can we use these tools. And it's such a low barrier introduction to this idea. Bring people who've never, ever thought that intractable conflicts can be resolved, to come visit and play with us and we can talk about it. But if you're going to use any of the tools, think first, Rob.
Perfect. Jan, I see your hand up.
Yes, Mary Lisa, I wanted to say that when you asked for questions, I didn't have any questions, and I realized it's because I was actually really listening and not trying to come up with a question ahead of time. So the fact that there weren't a lot of questions at the end, I think maybe it's a good sign.
Provoking a lot of thought. Thank you,
Mhm.
Jan. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your partnership. All right, you guys have got business to take care of. Thank you for the space and the warmth and also the history lesson today. I will carry that all day today. Thank you so much.